Abby Lockhart has returned home to the hills of Kentucky following her father's death in a suspicious accident, only to find her instincts screaming that the official report is a lie. Between her father's cryptic warnings and the ominous interest of a powerful local crime family, Abby is quickly pulled into the dangerous secrets her father kept. Will she trust me to help her expose the dark truths hidden beneath Mammoth Cave National Park before they silence her too?
My dad always said that the hills of Kentucky would call you home eventually. He said it like it was a good thing, like a gentle hand on your shoulder rather than a fist around your throat. Standing in the parking lot of the Brownsville Greyhound station at 6 in the morning, listening to the bus wheeze away behind me, my 2 biggest suitcases sitting in the gravel and September already trying to turn cold. I wasn't so sure he was right. But then, my dad had been wrong about a lot of things lately, including the part where he was supposed to still be alive. Don't cry in the parking lot, I thought to myself. You can cry in the car. You can cry later. Not here. I pulled out my phone and called old Hank Pruitt, who'd had Dad's truck at the shop since the accident, and he said he'd have his grandson bring it over in an hour. So I sat on my suitcase in the early light and breathed in the smell of limestone and wood smoke and the particular green wet earth smell that I had never once found in Louisville, no matter how many parks I walked through, and I let it hit me. I was home. Abigail May Lockhart, 31 years old, master's degree in marketing, rising star at Meridian Automotive Distribution, or at least she had been, before she'd taken an emergency leave of absence and packed everything she could reasonably fit into 2 suitcases. Home. To the town of Brownsville, Kentucky, population around 1,200 if you counted the folks out on Route 70, which not everyone did. My father, Gerald Lockhart, Jerry to everyone who knew him, which in Brownsville was literally everyone, had died 11 days ago. They told me it was his truck. Said the brakes had given out on the highway curve coming down off the ridge, the one everyone called Dead Man's, because of course they did. Said he'd gone over the guardrail and down into the creek bed. They ruled it an accident. My father, who could rebuild a brake system in his sleep, who checked his truck every Sunday morning like church, who I had never once seen skip a maintenance schedule in 31 years of watching him live and breathe machines. It was an accident. Say it enough times, and maybe it becomes true. Hank's grandson, a sweet, gap-toothed kid named Tyler who couldn't have been more than 19, showed up with Dad's old F-150 at 7:15, and he handed me the keys with his hat in his hand and his eyes cast down, and he said, "I'm real sorry about Mr. Jerry, Miss Abby. He was awful good to me." And that did it. I made it until I was pulling out of the lot, and then I cried the whole 12 minutes it took to drive to Lockhart Road. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but it always did. Memory has a way of making everything bigger, cleaner, brighter than it actually was. And then you come back and reality peels all that away, and there's just a white clapboard house with green shutters that needs painting, sitting at the end of a gravel drive with a barn-red mechanic shop behind it and 40 acres of trees between it and the park boundary. Mammoth Cave National Park. I could see the tree line from the porch. I'd spent half my childhood in those woods. I sat in the truck in the driveway for a long time before I went inside.
The radio crackled with nothing useful, which was about par for the morning so far. I'd been head ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park for exactly 6 weeks, and in 6 weeks I had learned 3 things with any certainty. The cave system was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen in 20 years of working national parks. The local county roads were an absolute menace in the rain, and whoever had set up the ranger station's coffee maker deserved some kind of formal reprimand. I was parked at the trailhead off Brownsville Road, running through the sector maps I'd been memorizing. 52,000 surface acres, 400-plus miles of surveyed passageway underground, and then however many miles of passage that hadn't been mapped yet, which various people estimated in various ways, but which I privately thought of as a lot. My predecessor had left detailed notes. His handwriting, however, was approximately the consistency of seismic activity, so I was still working through them. I heard the truck. Before I saw it, old engine, well-maintained, not a rattle in it, which was unusual for a vehicle that sounded like it had some years on it. It came down Brownsville Road slow and then turned onto the gravel lane that led up toward the White House I'd noticed my first week here, the one with the mechanic shop out back. I'd clocked it as privately owned in-holding, neighboring parkland on 3 sides. Whoever was driving parked and sat there for a good 5 minutes without getting out. Not my business. People have their reasons, I thought. I put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the road. Sector maps weren't going to memorize themselves, and I had a ridge patrol in 2 hours. I almost didn't glance back, but I did. Force of habit, maybe. Or something else, some peripheral awareness instinct that 11 years of rangering had built into my bones. A woman had gotten out of the truck, standing in the driveway with her face tipped up toward the tree line at the far edge of the property, and even from this distance I could see the stillness in how she stood. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was something more complicated than that, like she was having a conversation with the trees. None of my business. I drove.
There is a particular hell in going through a parent's house after they're gone. You don't know how particular it is until you're standing in your dead father's kitchen holding a coffee mug that says "World's Okayest Mechanic," a gift you gave him 14 years ago as a teenager because you thought you were hilarious, and you can't decide whether to wash it or set it down or just hold it until your hands stop shaking. I set it down. The house was clean, which surprised me. Dad wasn't messy exactly, but he wasn't meticulous. This was meticulous. Like someone had been through it recently and straightened everything up. Or like someone had been looking for something. Stop. I said to myself, you're looking for problems because you don't know how to just be sad. Classic. I unpacked my suitcases into my old room. Still the same, still the dark blue walls I'd painted at 16 and the old quilt my grandma made. Still the window that looked straight into the tree line. And then I went out to the shop. The shop was locked. That was normal. Dad always locked it. Except my key didn't fit. The lock had been changed, and recently. Because the brass around the keyhole was still bright and unweathered. I stood there staring at that bright brass for a long minute. I called Hank Pruitt again. "Oh, sure," Hank said, easy as anything. "Jerry changed that lock a few months back, said he was having some trouble. Don't rightly know with what. He gave the spare to Jimmy at the hardware store, said to give it to you if... Well, a pause. I'll have Jimmy bring it over. Some trouble. I didn't know what that meant. My father had called me every Sunday, regular as weather, and he had not once mentioned trouble. He talked about the weather and the deer count and whether the Wildcats were going to make it worth watching this season. He had not mentioned trouble. What else hadn't he told me? Jimmy Reardon brought the key over that afternoon. A little man in a canvas jacket who'd run the hardware store for 30 years, and he pressed it into my hand with both of his and looked at me with something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. "You planning on staying a while, Abby?" he asked. "For now." He nodded slowly. "You be careful then. Your dad?" He stopped. "He was a good man. You be careful." He was gone before I could ask him what that meant.
The Ridge Patrol took most of the afternoon, which suited me fine. I liked the physical work of it. The miles covering ground, reading the landscape, noting what had changed since my last pass. Mammoth Cave's surface was as complex as its underground in its own way, all limestone karst and sinkholes and old-growth forest, and it took time to learn it properly. I was covering the eastern sector when I found the snare. Then the second one. Then the third. Not unusual for parkland adjacent to private property, poaching pressure was a constant management challenge, and whoever had set these was targeting deer. Small operation, still illegal. I documented them and radioed it in, and then I pulled up the parcel records on my tablet to see whose property line was close enough to be relevant. Lockhart. Gerald Lockhart, private inholding, neighboring parkland on the northeastern side. I made a note to stop by. It was possible the snares were set by someone using Lockhart property without permission, in which case it would be useful to know the owner's awareness level. It was equally possible someone from the property had set them, in which case the conversation would be different. Either way, it was a neighbor conversation, part of the job. I swung by on my way back to the station at around 5 o'clock. The F-150 was still in the driveway. There was a light on in the house. I knocked on the front door. The woman who opened it was not what I expected, and I'm going to be honest. I hadn't had any particular expectation, because the property was listed to a Gerald Lockhart, male, 63. She was very much not Gerald Lockhart. She was maybe 5'4", honey blonde hair that was a little disheveled, like she'd been running her hands through it, and eyes that were somewhere between blue and not quite gray and were currently looking at me with a wariness that I clocked immediately. She had a smear of grease on her left forearm, and she was holding a wrench in her own doorway. Neither of those things were what I expected, but what truly threw me off balance was how beautiful she was. Not in a runway model way, but in the pretty girl next door way. In a quiet way that just makes a guy stop and take a second look to truly appreciate all the feminine curves and delicate features. Shockingly pretty, to the point of taking my breath away. I made myself snap my mind back to the job. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mom," I said. "I'm Seth Whittaker. Head Ranger with Mammoth Cave. I wanted to talk to whoever owns this property about some activity I found on the park boundary this afternoon. Her chin came up a fraction. I own it, or I will, once the estate goes through. What kind of activity? Snares, along the northeastern boundary. 3 of them within about 60 yards of your property line. Something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt. Something else. Calculation, maybe. Or the particular exhaustion of someone who has been piling bad news on top of bad news all day and has just received another installment. Are you saying you think I set them? I'm saying I don't know anything yet. That's why I'm here. A beat. Then slowly the wariness shifted into something that might have been a reluctant acknowledgement of reasonable behavior. I just got back today, she said. I haven't been out to the tree line at all. My name is Abby Lockhart. Gerald was my father. He passed away 11 days ago. Damn. Easy, Whittaker, I thought. I'm sorry for your loss, I said, and I meant it. She looked at me for a moment, then she stepped back from the door. You want coffee? I just made some.
Loving this story? Please help me to know that I have hit the mark by tapping that like button. And don't miss the next one. Be sure to subscribe. I don't know why I invited him in. Okay, that's not completely true. I know exactly why I invited him in, because it was 5 o'clock and I'd been alone in my dead father's house all day, with my bad feeling and my suspicious lockbox, and the hardware store man's cryptic warning, and this ranger with his calm brown eyes and his sun-streaked hair that was absolutely past due for a cut had just said, I don't know anything yet, instead of making assumptions, and something about that had rattled loose some of the tension in my chest. That, and I was out of practice at being alone. He sat at my father's kitchen table, the same table where I'd done 1,000 homework assignments and eaten 10,000 dinners, and had every major conversation of my childhood, and he wrapped both hands around the mug I gave him, and he looked around the kitchen the way people do when they're trying to learn a place rather than just occupy it. He fills up the room. That's just observation. He's tall and has the warmest brown eyes, and his hair is just a bit too long, making it curl at the back of his neck. These are just facts I'm noticing. Stop it, I told myself. You said Gerald was your father, he said. I had the property flagged under his name, but I didn't know much else about the parcel. He's owned it for 35 years. Grew up around here, never left. I sat down across from him with my own coffee. I left. Came back for college breaks and holidays, but I've been in Louisville for the better part of a decade. What brought you back? He died. Blunt, maybe. But I was tired of dancing around it. The truck, they said, brake failure. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, just a slight sharpening of attention. I'm sorry, that's a rough thing. Yeah. I turned the coffee mug in my hands. The world's okayest mechanic one. He was a mechanic, though. Ran the shop out back for 40 years. Maintained his own vehicles. I didn't say the rest. What was the rest? That I'd been spending the whole afternoon out in the shop that I'd finally gotten open, going through his books and finding numbers that didn't make sense, that the shop accounts showed payments. Large ones, irregular intervals, no corresponding invoices. Going back almost 2 years? You grew up here? He asked. Born and raised? Spent a lot of time in the park, actually. My property backs up to the northeast boundary, and when I was a kid that was basically just the woods where I played. You know the terrain? Better than most. I looked up at him. Why? A small smile. Not a big production of it. Just a quiet shift at the corner of his mouth. The snares. If someone's been using your land to access the park, they'd need to know how to get through the boundary without being obvious about it. Locals know that better than anyone, and you're wondering if I know who might have that knowledge. Like I said, those brown eyes steady on mine. I don't know anything yet. He keeps saying that, like he's decided not to decide. I don't know whether that's patience or evasion. But he's still here, and I'm still talking, and the house feels a little less empty. We talked for an hour. About the park, mostly, him learning the landscape, me knowing it in the bone-deep way you know a place where you spent your formative years. He asked good questions. Specific ones. He wasn't making conversation. He was gathering information, which I recognized because it's what I do in meetings when I'm trying to understand something before I form an opinion. When he stood to leave, he was careful about it. Pushed his chair in, rinsed his mug at the sink without being asked. He pulled on his jacket by the door, and he looked down at me with something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite something else. You have my card, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd left it on the table when he came in. If you see anything unusual out near that tree line, or if anyone comes to the property asking about those snares, will you call me? Sure, I said. And he paused. I meant what I said. I'm sorry about your father. I stood in the doorway and watched his truck until it was out of sight, and then I stood there a little longer in the cooling evening air and tried to remember the last time I had sat at a kitchen table with someone and just talked. Like that. Then I went inside and went back to my father's account books, because the numbers still didn't add up, and the unease in my stomach wasn't going to let me sleep anyway.
I drove back to the station thinking about brake failure. Occupational habit, maybe. You spend long enough doing law enforcement-adjacent work, you develop a reflex for things that don't sit right. And Abby Lockhart had not said anything concrete. She'd just said her father was a mechanic, had maintained his own truck, had died in what was being called an accident. She hadn't said she didn't believe it was an accident. She hadn't said she did believe it either. It's not your case. It's not your jurisdiction. You're a park ranger, not a county detective, I told myself. Right. And 3 poaching snares within 60 yards of her property line were absolutely in my jurisdiction, and I had no reason to connect those to anything else. And yet, she was interesting. I registered that the way you register any relevant piece of information. Filed it. Moved on. The way her face had done that thing when I said I didn't know anything yet, like she'd expected it to have to fight, and then didn't have to. The grease on her arm. The wrench. A woman who goes straight from arriving at her father's house to working in his shop on the day she gets back. That was someone who processed things by doing. I recognized that, too. The poaching snares were professional grade, not some kid with a YouTube tutorial. Whoever set them knew exactly what they were doing. I drove back to the station and pulled the incident reports from the last 18 months. Looked for patterns, any unusual activity along the northeastern park boundary, any complaints from the Lockhart property, any names that came up more than once in the area. One name came up twice. Daniel Combs. Trespassing complaint 6 months ago. Hunting violation 8 months ago. Both in the northeastern sector. I made a note. Then I went home and ate dinner and told myself I was done thinking about it for the night. I thought about it for most of the night.
3 weeks in, Brownsville had settled around me the way small towns do. Slowly, and with judgment, and then all at once, people started coming by, bringing casseroles, sitting in my kitchen and telling me about my father, which was both a gift and a knife, because some of what they told me was wonderful, and some of it told me, very clearly, that I had not known everything there was to know about Gerald Lockhart. He'd been worried, in the months before he died. People said it in the careful way people say things they don't want to say directly. He seemed preoccupied, and he mentioned having some business to sort out, and he was a little quieter than usual. No one knew what it was, or no one was telling me. The account books were the clearest thing I had. The payments going out, cash withdrawals, no names, irregular but large, had started about 22 months ago and had gotten bigger over time. The business itself was in decent shape, all things considered, but those withdrawals had been eating into it month by month. By the last 6 months, the shop was bleeding. I was a marketing professional, not a forensic accountant. But I'd grown up watching my dad run his business, and I knew what healthy books looked like. These weren't healthy. I also started finding other things. A second phone? A burner, one of those disposable prepaid ones, tucked in the back of the desk drawer in the shop office. Dead, but I bought a charger that fit, and when it turned on, there were 3 texts from an unknown number. The most recent one, dated 4 days before my father died, said, "Final warning, Wednesday." Okay, that's something. I sat in the shop office for a long time with that phone in my hands and the smell of motor oil around me, and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. I thought about calling the county sheriff. I thought about what Hank Pruitt would say, or Jimmy Reardon with his careful eyes. I thought about the way those words, "You be careful," had landed. Then I thought about the park ranger's card that was still sitting on my kitchen table. I picked up my regular phone, and I called Seth Whittaker.
She called on a Thursday evening, and I almost didn't pick up because the number wasn't in my contacts. Ranger instinct made me answer anyway. You never know when it's someone at a trailhead with an emergency. "This is Abby Lockhart." Her voice was steady, controlled. The voice of someone who had decided to make a decision and was executing it before they could talk themselves out of it. "I found something. I'm not sure what to do with it, and I know your park service, and this is probably outside your lane, but you said to call if... Tell me." She told me about the account books, the cash withdrawals, the burner phone, the text. "Final warning," she said. "Wednesday. He died on a Wednesday." I was quiet for a moment. Have you touched the phone much? Just to charge it and look at the text. Okay, don't touch it anymore. Put it in a Ziploc bag if you have one. A pause. I'm going to come over. Is that all right? Yes. Then a beat, and she said, thank you. I was at her door in 20 minutes. She let me in, and the kitchen was clean, and there was coffee already made, and the Ziploc bag with the phone was on the table, and she looked like she hadn't slept well in a week, which she probably hadn't. I looked at the phone without picking it up, read the texts through the bag, and then I looked at the books she spread on the table. She talked me through what she'd found, clearly, organized, no editorializing. She'd laid it out the way someone who's good at presenting information lays things out. You were in marketing, I said, automotive parts, something almost like a smile. The industry isn't exciting, but the data analysis is. These cash amounts, do they correspond to any billing records, any client accounts? None. And the intervals are irregular, which makes me think they weren't scheduled. They were reactive. Someone asked and he paid. I sat back. Abby, has anyone come to the property since you arrived? Anyone you didn't expect? She hesitated just long enough to tell me there was something she'd been weighing. 2 men came by 6 days ago, she said. Said they were friends of my dad's. Wanted to pay their respects. I'd never seen them before. They were polite. The word polite came out with a particular flavor. They asked how long I was staying. Did they give names? One of them was Danny Combs. Something went still in me. Who was with him? His younger brother, Marcus. I pulled out my notebook and I wrote the name down, and then I looked up at her and I said what I'd been thinking since the moment she said final warning. I don't think your father's accident was an accident, I said, and I think whoever is responsible might still be keeping an eye on this property. The color didn't drain from her face. Her jaw tightened instead. She looked at the table and then back at me, and there was fear in her eyes. Real, honest fear. But under it was something harder and steadier. Tell me what you know about Daniel Combs, I said.
Danny Combs. Of course it was Danny Combs. I hadn't thought about him in years. Not deliberately, anyway, the way you don't think about things you've successfully filed under, passed, and done. But when Seth said the name, something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Danny Combs had been 1 year ahead of me in high school. He'd been the kind of boy who took up space he hadn't been given, loud in hallways, close standing in conversations, always with that sideways smile that meant he was already 2 steps ahead of whatever was happening, and he wanted you to know it. His family had money in the way that old county families have money. You weren't sure where it came from exactly, but it was there, and it bought a particular kind of latitude. He'd come after me once. Junior year of his, sophomore year of mine. Showed up at the shop after closing, leaned in the doorway while I was elbow deep in a transmission, and told me I should come to his party that weekend. I'd said no thank you. He'd called me Little Mouse and said I'd come around. I hadn't come around. And he hadn't forgotten it. I could tell that from the way he'd looked at me in the hallways for the rest of his senior year. Not angry, exactly. More like someone keeping a tab running. 10 years. 10 years, and he's still keeping the tab. And now my father is dead. He was the oldest of 3 brothers. I told Seth, and I heard how flat my voice came out and didn't bother fixing it. His family had a place out on Route 231. Big spread, horses. Old money that kept getting added to, which always made me wonder. His father died when Danny was in his 20s. He and his brothers took over whatever the family was running. What do you know about what they run? Officially? Nothing. Unofficially. When I was in high school, people said there was money in things that weren't horses. I looked at him. Drugs was what people said. I didn't know enough to know if that was true or just talk. Seth was quiet for a moment, looking at his notebook. He had a way of going still when he was thinking, not checked out, just interior. Like the processing was happening somewhere you couldn't see. The name Combs comes up in park incident reports, he said. Daniel specifically. Trespassing and a hunting violation, both on the northeastern boundary, both within the last year. My boundary, your boundary. I thought about the snares he'd found his first day. I thought about the text on the burner phone. I thought about my father's truck going over the guardrail, on a curve he'd driven 1,000 times. I think he owed them money, I said. Dad? I think he owed them money, and they were using him somehow, and they killed him for it. Now they're gonna come for me because the debt doesn't die when the person does. Seth didn't tell me I was jumping to conclusions. He didn't tell me I was being paranoid, or that there were other explanations. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "That's my read, too." There's something simultaneously terrible and steadying about having someone look at the worst thing you're afraid of and say, "Yes, I see it too." "So," I said, "what do we do?"
What we did was argue about it for 20 minutes, not badly, Ma, not loudly. But she had opinions about how to proceed, and I had opinions, and they weren't the same opinions. She wanted to go to the county sheriff immediately. I wanted to think first about whether the county sheriff was someone we could trust, given that a man had died in a suspicious vehicle accident and the ruling had been accident without, as far as I could tell, any significant investigation. "Are you saying the sheriff's office is dirty?" she demanded. "I'm saying I don't know, and in a county this size with a family this established, I want to be careful about who knows what before we show our hand. This isn't poker. No, it's more serious than poker, which is exactly why I want to be careful." She was quiet. I could see her turning it over. The same logic, the same reluctance to arrive at the conclusion, because the conclusion was, maybe no one in this county was safe to trust. And that was a cold, specific kind of alone. "She's not panicking. Give her that. Most people would be panicking right now. She's thinking." "State police," she said finally, "if we go over the county level." That's where I land to, and quietly, before we talk to anyone local. I paused. "But in the meantime, and I mean starting tonight, you shouldn't be here alone." Her eyes sharpened. "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. I'm talking about what happens if Danny Combs decides you've been here long enough and comes to have a more direct conversation about what your father owed." That landed. I watched it land, the slight tightening around her eyes, the breath she took through her nose. "I grew up in these woods," she said. "I know every inch of this property. And I believe you. That's actually useful information, and I want to talk about it." I looked at her steadily. "But not alone, okay? Not alone." A long pause. "Are you offering to babysit me, Ranger Whittaker?" "I'm offering to be an extra set of eyes while we figure out what we're dealing with. You can call it whatever you want." Something at the corner of her mouth shifted, almost a smile, quickly suppressed. "I have a guest room." "Then it sounds like we both have a plan."
Having Seth Whittaker in my house was a strange thing to get used to. Not bad strange, just present. He was a large person in a quiet way, which sounds like a contradiction, but isn't. He moved through the rooms without announcing himself, didn't take up conversational space he hadn't been offered, kept his coffee mug on the same corner of the counter so it was never in anyone's way. He was tidy, extremely tidy, military tidy, which I found out on day 2 was because he'd done a stint in the army before going into ranger service. He left every morning before 6 to do his patrol. He came back before dark, and after the first day he brought groceries without making a thing of it, just appeared in the kitchen with bags and started putting things away. "You don't have to," I started. "I know." He handed me the good coffee without discussion. He'd noticed the first day that I was using the off-brand stuff because I hadn't thought to buy the good kind, and he just fixed it. No commentary, no making me feel guilty for not having it. Just fixed it. Don't read into it. He's practical. He's here because there might be danger, and he's a law enforcement officer. It doesn't mean anything, although a small voice in the back of my mind wanted it to mean something. In the evenings, we worked. He had contacts at the state police, a friend from a previous posting, and he'd made a careful, preliminary call that had resulted in a quiet investigative interest. Not action yet. Questions. Meanwhile, I went through the rest of my father's papers with the thoroughness of someone who finally understood what she was looking for. The shop logs were the best evidence, not the financial books, the actual service records. Because my father, meticulous man that he was, had kept notes on every single vehicle that came through. And going back 2 years, a vehicle was coming in regularly, off the books, late at night, based on the timestamp anomalies I found in the security footage I'd recovered from the old hard drive. Combs, family vehicles, modified. The modifications weren't anything my father had written down, but the timestamps and the fuel receipts told a story. Vehicles coming in empty, going out lighter. Not by weight, but by the way they rode. Changed suspension? Maybe. Or a hidden compartment being serviced. I brought this to Seth one evening and watched his face do the thing it did when he was recalibrating. Not surprise, exactly. More like a door opening that had been expected. "Vehicles used for transport," he said. "That's what I think. Dad didn't know what they were transporting at first. Or maybe he did, and told himself it was just drugs, and that was manageable. And then at some point, he found out it was more than that. Guns." The words sat in the kitchen air like something physical. "The final warning," I said. "Wednesday. He tried to stop cooperating, and they killed him." Seth was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up, those brown eyes were steady, but there was something underneath them I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly. The thing underneath anger. The thing that happens when someone's slow fuse finally starts burning. "We need to move faster," he said.
Guns changed the calculation entirely. This was no longer about poaching snares or local drug money or even one man's death, as devastating as that was. This was organized crime with federal implications, and the state police contact I'd been briefing was now taking this considerably more seriously. He was talking about a joint operation. He was talking about timelines. He was talking about the kind of careful, systematic approach that was exactly right in terms of building a case, and exactly terrifying in terms of what might happen in the meantime. In the meantime, while Abby Lockhart was living on a property the Combs family clearly considered their operational territory. You're getting ahead of yourself. Do the next right thing. Don't borrow trouble from the future. But I kept thinking about the way Danny Combs had come to her door 3 weeks ago. Polite, she'd said. The word had carried all the things it wasn't. And the Combs family had a long reach in this county and patience born of decades of getting away with things. I started walking the property boundary at night. I told Abby I was doing a perimeter check, which was true. What I didn't say was that I was also removing the newer snares that had appeared. 3 more, different placement than the first batch. Someone learning my removal patterns. Someone who was watching. I didn't tell her about those, not yet. I was working on how much to tell her and how fast. That was a mistake. I knew it was a mistake, even as I made it. She was sharp, and she was observant, and she had been managing her own life without any help for a long time. And the decision to manage her information was not mine to make. She figured it out herself on a Thursday morning because of course she did. She came out to the tree line where I was making notes on the latest removal site, and she looked at the disturbed ground, and then she looked at me with those blue eyes that had a particular temperature when she was doing math she didn't like. "How many?" she said. 3 more. This is the 3rd location." "When?" "The most recent one was 2 nights ago." A beat. "And you didn't tell me." I met her eyes. "I should have. I'm sorry." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the tree line. "Don't do that again," she said. Not loudly, just exactly as serious as it needed to be. "I won't," I said, and I meant it. She looked at me for another moment, measuring something the way she measured things, and then she nodded once and said, "What are we doing next?" Not I. We. I noticed that.
The thing about sharing a house with someone under stress is that you skip the normal progression. You skip the careful early dating phase where everyone is performing the best version of themselves. You go straight to the real version, the unguarded 6 a.m. version, the I haven't eaten since noon version, the I'm scared and I don't want to say it version. I knew he took his coffee black. I knew he woke before his alarm every morning without fail, some internal clock that was more reliable than any app. I knew he cooked when he was thinking, methodical prep, the kind of cooking that's really just organized thinking with a side effect of food. I knew he laughed quietly, at himself mostly, and that his resting face was serious enough that the laugh felt like a gift when it came. I was not falling for him. I was noting relevant facts about a person I was sharing a house with in a difficult situation. Liar, I thought to myself. The evening that broke the careful thing we'd been maintaining came about a month in, on a night when the state police contact had called with news that was both good and bad. Good because they were ready to move on the investigation. Bad because the timeline was 2 to 3 weeks still, and in the meantime we needed to sit tight. We were on the porch. The October air had teeth in it, and I'd come out with my jacket, and he'd come out a few minutes later with his jacket already on, and 2 cups of coffee. 2 more weeks, I said, maybe 3, and we just stay here, act normal, hope they don't decide to accelerate their timeline. They don't know we know. He settled into the other porch chair, long legs stretched out, watching the tree line the way he always did. As far as the Combs family knows, you're a grieving daughter sorting out her father's estate. You haven't gone to the police. You haven't done anything that would spook them. Except the ranger parked in my driveway. Neighbor helping out a woman who just lost her father. This is a small town, people help. I turned that over. He was right, and it was smart, and also, is that what you are? A neighbor helping out? He looked over at me. The porch light was doing interesting things to the planes of his face. I'm whatever is most useful for you to be safe. I think you just skirted the question, I said with a bit of a wry smile on my face. A quiet moment. What would you like me to be? He asked, holding my gaze. Don't, I thought to myself. Don't open that door. You're in the middle of something dangerous and complicated, and this is the wrong time, and you cannot afford the distraction. Tell me something, I said instead. Something that has nothing to do with any of this. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I almost didn't take this posting. Why'd you take it? The caves. I'd read about them for years. The idea of all that space, underground. The idea that there's this whole world down there that most people never see. He paused. I like things that are more than they look from the surface. I looked at him for a moment, trying to decide if there was a hidden meaning in his words and deciding to skate around it. That's as good enough of a reason as any, I suppose. Yes, he said, still holding my gaze. The night settled around us, the tree line dark and full of its own secrets, and I thought about my father and his woods and the way this place had always felt like it was keeping something. Not threatening, just vast. More than you could see. Seth reached over and adjusted the throw blanket on the back of my chair so it fell more squarely around my shoulders. Just that. Without comment or ceremony, a small, protective and kind gesture, I pulled it tighter and we sat in the dark, and I thought, I am in so much trouble.
I was not handling this well. Professionally, yes, absolutely. The information was flowing correctly. The contact with state police was being appropriately managed. The property perimeter was being monitored. All of that was fine. The rest of it was not fine. You like her, I thought to myself. That's the problem. You like her more than you should for someone you have only known a short time. You like the way she goes at the account books like a puzzle she's personally offended by, the way she doesn't ask for reassurance she doesn't need, the way she laughs when something catches her off guard and it's like the laugh surprised even her. You like the way she smells like fresh air and whatever shampoo she uses in the mornings. You are staying in her house. You are here to protect her. But my feelings for her are no longer only professional. This is a significant problem. I'd had a professional code about this for a long time, built on some accumulated wisdom from watching other people handle these situations poorly. Don't get involved with anyone in a professional context where your judgment matters. The stakes are too high and the complications are too predictable. And then there was Abby Lockhart, who was not making this easy by any measure. The evening on the porch had pushed something, not over a line. Neither of us had let it go over a line. But I'd felt where the line was in a way I hadn't quite felt before, which was its own information. I woke up at 3 a.m, which was unusual. I lay still for a moment doing the threat assessment thing that was apparently hardwired into my nervous system, going through the sounds of the house and finding nothing wrong. Then I heard it. The soft pad of her footsteps, the creak of the third board from the top of the stairs, which I'd memorized by now. She came downstairs at 3 a.m. sometimes, just once or twice since I'd been here, but I'd noticed. I always heard her, and I always lay still and let her have the dark and the quiet of the kitchen. Tonight, I didn't. I pulled on jeans and a shirt and went downstairs, and she was at the kitchen table in her father's old flannel robe with a mug of tea, not coffee, which meant she wasn't trying to wake up. She was trying to calm down. She looked up when I came in. No surprise, which told me she'd heard me too. I put the kettle on without asking. "Bad dream?" I said. "Just thinking." She wrapped both hands around her mug. About Dad. About what he knew, toward the end. What he must have been carrying. I sat down across from her. The kitchen was quiet and dark except for the light over the stove. "He was protecting you," I said. "Everything he kept from you. That was protection." "I know." A long exhale. "I just wish he'd trusted me enough to let me help." I poured my tea and sat back and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. And sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is just stay. We sat there for a long time in the dark kitchen with our tea going cold, and I watched her face in the low light and thought, 2 more weeks. Just get her through 2 more weeks, and then it's done and she's safe and you can figure out the rest of it. I thought it like a promise.
The mistake I made was going out to the cave entrance alone. I know exactly what that sounds like. I want to be clear that I was not being reckless, or not intentionally. Seth had a mandatory all-staff meeting at the Park Visitor Center that afternoon, the kind of administrative obligation that couldn't be rescheduled, and that he'd been apologetic about all morning. I'd told him I was fine, I'd stay in the house, I'd call if anything felt wrong. That was my intention. But at 2 o'clock I'd found something in the shop that changed everything. It was a notebook, hidden in the false bottom of the old toolbox under the workbench. Dad's toolbox, the one that had been his father's before him, cast iron with a bottom compartment that I'd forgotten existed until my elbow hit the release latch. The notebook was leather-covered and small and dense with my father's terrible handwriting, and in it was everything. Dates. Vehicle makes and models. Descriptions. Not of drugs, of people. Initials and crude descriptions and pickup locations, and one line near the end, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest. Can't do it anymore. They're bringing children through. I called Seth immediately. Voicemail. The meeting had started. I left a message. I found something. Call me when you can. It's important, but I'm okay. I sat with the notebook for 20 minutes, and then I did the thing I'd been told not to do. There was a cave entrance on the back of the property. Small, natural, not the tourist kind. One of hundreds of wild cave openings in the karst landscape around Mammoth Cave. Dad had showed it to me when I was 10 and made me promise never to go in alone. I'd kept that promise until I was 14, and then I'd broken it approximately 40 times. Because I was 14 and the cave was magical, and I was very good at navigating it. I knew it went deeper than the explored portions. I knew, from the vehicle logs I decoded, that the timeline of late-night visits to the shop corresponded with deliveries. And I knew, from a detail in the notebook I hadn't told Seth yet, that my father had written down a storage location. Underground, the back property entrance. There was evidence in that cave. Evidence the state police needed. Evidence that could move the timeline up by weeks. You should wait. Seth said wait. You know you should wait. I got my headlamp. The cave entrance was where I remembered it. Behind the big sycamore at the northeast corner, behind a natural limestone shelf you'd never see if you didn't know to look. I squeezed through, and the darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment I just stood still and breathed it in. Underground air. Cool and still and faintly mineral. The smell of deep earth and wet limestone. I'd always loved it. I moved deeper, following the passage I'd memorized decades ago. And the passage widened into the first chamber. And the first chamber narrowed into the squeeze. I'd always called the belly because it was exactly that, a stomach-clenching crawl for about 15 feet before it opened up again. I came through the belly and stood up and swept my headlamp around the second chamber. The storage boxes were stacked against the far wall. 15 of them. Uniform, military surplus, padlocked. Whatever was in them was heavy. I could tell by the way they sat on the cave floor. I pulled out my phone and photographed everything. The boxes, their arrangement, the padlocks, the marks in the dust on the floor where they'd been moved recently. I was photographing the fourth box when the light hit the wall above me. Not my light. Another one. Coming from the belly. Move. Move now. Move. I killed my headlamp. Complete darkness. The kind you only get underground. Not darkness like a room with the lights off, but absolute, pressing, total absence of light. My heart went from 60 to 120 in the time it took to breathe once. The light from the belly grew brighter. Someone was crawling through. More than one person. I could hear the sounds of movement, could hear low voices. I moved backward in the dark by memory, pressing my body against the cave wall, moving by the texture of the stone beneath my fingertips. I knew this chamber. I knew there was a secondary passage to the right, partially hidden behind a limestone outcrop. Small, not usable for boxes, but absolutely usable for a person of average size who grew up crawling through caves. The first light cleared the belly entrance. I heard boots on cave floor. Someone's been here, a voice I didn't know. Check the boxes. I was moving. Slow, silent, stock-still instincts from childhood games in these passages. Don't rush. Don't scrape. Breathe through your mouth. My fingers found the outcrop. Behind it, the passage opened. Barely. Tight enough that I felt my jacket catch. Footprints in the dust. Another voice. Closer now. Fresh. I held my breath and slipped sideways into the passage. And then I heard a third voice. One I recognized. Deeper, measured, with that particular quality of someone who never raises it because they've never needed to. Find her. Danny Combs.
I saw her voicemail notification when the meeting broke at 4:15. I listened to it in the parking lot of the visitor center with my blood pressure doing something I did not care for. Call me when you can. It's important, but I'm okay. Okay, was the word she'd chosen, which meant she was measuring and not panicking, which meant she thought she had time. I called. No answer. I called again. No answer. I was in my truck before I finished the second call, driving faster than was technically within guidelines for a government vehicle, and I was on the radio to my deputy calling in an off-duty welfare check with possible criminal activity while I drove. 12 minutes to the property. Felt like 40. Her truck was in the driveway. The house door was unlocked, which she didn't do given the current danger. The notebook was there on the kitchen table. I didn't stop to read it. I grabbed my tactical flashlight and my radio and I went out the back through the yard toward the tree line, because I knew these woods and I knew there was a cave entrance back here. She'd mentioned it once, briefly. And I knew exactly the kind of thing that Abby Lockhart would decide was worth going alone to investigate. She found evidence. She's in the cave and in danger. Stop calculating and move, I thought as I broke into a run across the backyard toward the tree line and the parkland. I radioed my deputy again. Need backup at the Lockhart property, northeast boundary. Possible armed suspects in a cave system adjacent to parkland. Contact state police. Use the code I gave you last week. The code that would get my contact's attention without going through local channels. The sycamore was where she described it. The entrance was hidden but not invisible if you were looking, and I was very much looking. I went in. Cave systems had a particular logic. The air moved in predictable ways, sound carried in unexpected directions, and light betrayed your position from 50 feet away. I killed my flashlight and went by touch and memory of the rough map she'd sketched me one evening on a napkin, half talking about something else, unconsciously accurate. The voices reached me before the light did. 2 men, maybe 3, moving in the second chamber. And then a sound that froze everything in me. Not a voice, a scrape. Something moving fast against rock, running, then a shout. I moved. She came through a secondary passage at a full run, which meant she was out of options, which meant she'd burned her cover, and she came straight into me in the dark, and I caught her by both arms before she could hit the cave wall, and she made a sound, not a scream, but something compressed and desperate. And I said her name low and urgent, right against her ear. It's me, Abby. It's me. The sound she made then was different, still scared, but grounded. There are at least 3 of them, she breathed. Danny's with them, the boxes, the evidence. Photographed? Yes. Good. Then we don't need the boxes. We need to get you out. She grabbed my arm in the dark. Her grip was iron. The passage I came through. It connects to the main park system about 200 meters in. I know the way. They won't know it. I looked toward the sounds. Closer now. Maybe 40 feet, maybe less. Lead, I said. She took my hand and led us into the dark.
Here's the thing about navigating a cave system in total darkness. You have to let everything else go. Every fear that isn't immediately relevant. Every thought that isn't the next step, the next handhold, the next passage. Your brain, bless it, does not like this at all. Your brain wants to think about everything simultaneously. About the man 30 feet behind you. About the sound of boots on cave floor. About whether the passage ahead is the one you think it is, or whether memory is lying to you. I'd been in this section of cave maybe 30 times in my life, and never in complete darkness, and never with someone behind me trying to catch me, and never with a man the size of Seth Whittaker holding my hand and following my lead through a passage that got, at one point, genuinely uncomfortable even for me. His breathing was controlled. That helped. I could feel it in the steady rhythm of his grip, tight but not crushing, following my direction with a trust I was trying not to think too hard about, because if I thought about it, I would get emotional, and that was not useful right now. The voices behind us were echoing strangely, which meant they hadn't found the secondary passage entrance yet. Cave acoustics are disorienting if you don't know them. Sounds bounce and multiply and come from directions that make no sense. That was in our favor. "Step down," I whispered. 8 inches. He stepped. Silent. Left curve ahead. Keep your hand on the right wall. The passage opened into a narrow gallery. I could tell by the way the air changed, the way the sound of our movement dispersed rather than bouncing back. I turned on my headlamp for 3 seconds, just long enough to confirm where I was, then killed it again. The junction I needed was 20 feet ahead. Left would take us steeper. Right would take us up, toward a secondary park access point I'd used as a kid to emerge into the woods about half a mile from the property boundary. "Right here," I said. "It gets tight for a while. Can you—" "I'll fit." No hesitation. He nearly didn't. There was a moment, 30 feet into the tight section, when I heard his breathing change and felt him stop, and I turned back, and in the dark, I put my hand on his chest, just below his collarbone, and felt his heart going hard and fast. "Slow breath," I said quietly. "Don't fight the wall, move with it." A beat. Then his breath evened out. He moved. We came out of the tight section into a larger chamber, and we both stopped and listened. The voices were gone. Or they were far enough away that the cave wasn't carrying them to us anymore. Seth's hand was still in mine. I became aware of this simultaneously with the awareness that the immediate crisis had downshifted, just slightly, from move to breathe. "You okay?" I asked. "Define okay." But his voice was dry, not distressed, that careful, almost humor he deployed when things had been genuinely bad. "The exit is about 15 minutes from here," I said. "Can you give me 15 minutes?" "I can give you as long as you need." I turned on the headlamp at half power and led us the rest of the way out.
We came out of the cave into the October evening light like something surfacing, and I don't use that metaphor carelessly. There is a specific quality to the air above ground that you don't appreciate until you've been underground, and when it hit my face, I took a breath that was probably undignified in its intensity. Abby was already moving, assessing the tree line, getting her bearings, pulling out the phone she'd kept in her jacket pocket. "Photographs are still here," she said, "but 15 boxes, military surplus, padlocked. Storage location matches the notebook." "Let me see the notebook." She described it on the run-out. I'd been cataloging details to report. "In the house. I didn't bring it." "Good." I called my deputy. State police had been notified, backup was 12 minutes out, and the county sheriff, I'd made the call to read him in after my state police contact had vetted him as clean, was also moving. Abby was watching me during the call. When I finished, she said, "Danny was in there." "I know. He heard us. He knows I found the boxes." "I know. Which means we don't go back to the house without backup." I looked at her. She had limestone dust on her jacket and a scrape along her left cheekbone where she'd caught the cave wall, and she was running on adrenaline that was starting to convert to something shakier, though she was fighting it. "You did everything right. The photographs, that's the evidence. We have what we need." She looked at me for a long moment. "I went in alone. I told you I wouldn't, and I did." "You found critical evidence and you got yourself out." A pause. "And you got me out." Something in her face shifted. She looked down, then back up. "You trusted me in there?" "Yes," I said. Simple, because it was. She took a breath that was the first one in a while that wasn't measured. I watched some of the held tension leave her shoulders. The sirens were distant but coming. Help was coming. I had her in an open clearing with sightlines in 3 directions and my hand near my sidearm and my eyes on the tree line. But she was alive, and she was looking at me, and for a moment, just a moment, the situation let us both breathe.
The next 72 hours were not romantic, is what I'm saying. State police, statements, evidence collection, men in protective gear going into that cave and coming out with expressions that told me the boxes had contained exactly what we feared, not drugs, but weapons, high-grade military-style weapons. The county sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Tackett, who turned out to be trustworthy and very, very angry about what had been happening in his county, sat across from me for 3 hours with the recorder running and took everything I had. They arrested 2 of the men from the cave that same night. Danny Combs was not among them. That detail sat in me like a splinter. They found the other 2. Danny had gone deeper into the cave system, the part neither I nor Seth had mapped, and disappeared. They had officers on every road out of the county. They had a warrant. They were looking. He was still out there. The state police put a protection detail on the property, which should have made me feel safer, and mostly did, except for the part where I couldn't stop thinking about the way Danny had moved through high school, always knowing things before they happened, always 2 steps ahead, keeping tabs. Seth didn't leave. He'd technically been relieved of any informal protective role the moment the official protection detail arrived, but he was still there, sleeping in the guest room, showing up in the kitchen at 6 a.m. I didn't tell him to go. I don't want him to go. That's the true thing. I could dress it up in practical reasons. The house is big, there's danger still, I trust him. And all of those things are also true. But the real truth is that I have gotten used to him being here in a way that terrifies me slightly. On the 3rd morning after the cave, we had a conversation about his job. The park superintendent called, he said, over coffee. I've been absent from regular duties for a few days. You should go back. He looked at me steadily. There's still an open warrant. There's a protection detail. There's a protection detail, he agreed. That's not the same thing. I held my coffee mug with both hands. Seth, I can't let you. This isn't your responsibility anymore. If it ever was. I'd like to keep making that choice myself if you don't mind. Why? A pause. He set his mug down and looked at me directly, and there was something in his expression I'd been watching him manage for weeks. Careful, deliberate management of something that kept pushing against whatever wall he'd put it behind. Because I find I'm not particularly interested in leaving, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. That's kind of you? I said, after a moment. No! The corner of his mouth shifted. It's not. It's selfish.
I had been telling myself I would say nothing until the warrant was resolved, until she was safe. Definitively, not provisionally, until the situation had resolved itself enough that I could be certain I wasn't confusing crisis proximity for something more durable. I'd said half of it at the kitchen table. I hadn't said the rest. The rest was I'd been in 17 national parks in 20 years of service. I'd worked wildfire seasons and flood evacuations and search and rescues in terrain that would end careers. I'd been good at the job in all of them, and I'd been fine leaving all of them. The idea of leaving Mammoth Cave and the White House on Lockhart Road and Abbey specifically was not something I could get traction on. That's significant. You know that's significant, I thought. She was careful with me, careful and observant in the way she was careful and observant about everything, noting things without making a show of noticing, filing details away. She'd noticed that I walked on the street side when we went into town. She'd noticed that I always waited until she had her coffee before I started talking in the morning. She'd noticed that I checked the door lock every night before I went up to bed. Not because I thought she couldn't do it, but because it was automatic, the kind of care that's been wired in so long it stops being a decision. She'd noticed, and she hadn't said anything, and the not saying was a kind of answer to something I hadn't quite asked yet. The day the warrant was served, 13 days after the cave, I got the call while I was doing a sector patrol in the park's eastern quadrant. Danny Combs had been picked up at the Tennessee border, in custody, charged. I sat in my truck for a minute after I hung up. Then I drove to the house.
He didn't make it in time. Which, I need to tell you the whole thing, because what happened that afternoon was not something either of us anticipated, and I want it on record that it happened because the thing nobody had thought to verify was that the protection detail had 2-hour coverage gaps between shift changes. 2 hours during which the driveway was empty. And someone had been watching for exactly those gaps. Not Danny. Danny was in custody in Tennessee. His brother Marcus was a different conversation entirely. I'd known Marcus Combs existed the way you know a lot of people in a small county. Peripherally, vaguely. He was 4 years younger than Danny, which put him around my age, and quieter, which I had mistakenly processed as less dangerous. The quietness was not lesser. The quietness was just different. He came through the back while I was in the shop, and I didn't hear the door because I was running an engine diagnostic and the reader was beeping, and I had my back turned, and the first thing I knew was the cold pressure of something hard against the back of my head and a voice I half recognized saying very quietly, "You need to stop talking to police." My hands went still on the diagnostic reader, every cell in my body doing its own thing simultaneously, adrenaline, clarity, the strange time dilation of genuine threat. The engine was still running. The reader was still beeping. These absurd details, insisting on existing. Don't move. Think. You know this shop. You know every corner and every tool on every surface. Think. The evidence is already with the state police, I said. My voice was even. I was proud of it. Stopping my conversations doesn't change anything. It changes what you say on the witness stand. He moved around into my periphery, just enough that I could see him without turning. Tall, leaner than Danny, with the same set to his jaw but without Danny's performative confidence. Marcus Combs was scared and angry, and those two things together are more dangerous than either one alone. He had a gun. Small, semi-automatic, not pointed at me yet. Held like someone who wasn't entirely sure they wanted to use it, which was both a small comfort and no comfort at all. You have nowhere to go with this, I said. Keep him talking. Keep the transaction verbal as long as possible. Your brother is in custody. The evidence is documented. Whatever you do here makes it worse for you. Shut up. I'm trying to help you. Which was arguably true, in a very narrow sense. I said shut up. He raised the gun. Now it was pointed at me, and the diagnostic reader was still beeping, and the engine was running, and the detail about the engine running lodged in my brain with a specific significance. The engine was running. I was standing at the front of the vehicle. The vehicle was in neutral. The floor jack that had been holding the passenger's side was 6 inches to my left. If you release the jack, the car drops. It drops loud, it's a distraction, and you're going to have maybe 2 seconds and you need to make them count. I dropped to my left elbow, hit the jack release with the heel of my hand, and the car dropped with a crash that filled the whole shop like a thunderclap, and I was already moving, low, fast, behind the engine block, and Marcus Combs shouted something, and I heard the shot and the windshield of the old Camry 2 bays down exploded, and I kept moving, around the back of the vehicle, toward the rolling tool cart. He came around the front of the car. I came from behind the cart, with the biggest wrench on the top tray. I want to be clear that I am not a violent person, and I did not plan any of this. And what I did was fueled entirely by the particular hot-cold clarity of someone who has decided they are going to survive this specific situation. I hit Marcus Combs across the forearm, and the gun bounced off the concrete floor and slid under the car, and he grabbed my wrist and I headbutted him, which I had never done in my life and do not recommend without significant build-up to the moment. And he staggered back and I ran. I made it out the shop door and across the driveway, and I was 3 steps from the back porch when I heard the truck.
I heard the shot while I was still on the road. Unmistakable. Not far. I was out of the truck before it fully stopped, moving toward the shop, and she came through the door at a dead run. I caught her by the shoulders, and she was breathing hard, and there was blood on her temple, a scrape, not a wound, and her eyes were wide and clear. Shop, Marcus Combs, guns under the car. Are you hit? No. I shielded her as I moved her behind the truck. Stay behind the engine block, don't move. Seth, she said with urgency in her voice, I've got it. I went into the shop at a low angle, weapon drawn, moving through the systematic clearing I drilled into muscle memory over years of training. Marcus Combs was in the third bay, sitting against the wall with his forearm cradled against his chest at an angle that indicated something I'd heard was called a radial fracture. The gun was under the car, 6 feet from him, out of reach. He looked up at me, and his expression was the specific exhaustion of someone whose entire plan has collapsed. I cuffed him, called it in, sat him down with his back against the wall, and went back outside to Abby. She was still behind the truck. She'd been watching the door the whole time. When I came out, she tracked me with her eyes all the way to where she was standing, and I could see the adrenaline leaving her. I've seen it enough times to recognize it, the way the shoulders drop and the breath changes and the hands start to shake a little. I put my hands on either side of her face. Careful. Looked at the scrape on her temple. It's nothing, she said. I know. I kept looking at it anyway. He shot at me. I know. My voice was steadier than I felt. Tell me what you did. She told me about the jack, about the wrench. I looked at her for a long moment. You dropped the car, I said. It was the loudest thing available. Abby, I exhaled. That was remarkably good thinking. I didn't have a lot of options. You had the options you made. She looked at me. The adrenaline was mostly gone now, and what was underneath it was the realness of how close it had been, and also, I could see it. Something else. Relief, maybe? Or the thing that happens after. I pulled her into me without planning to. She came without planning to. We stood there in the driveway of her father's house with the shop behind us and sirens starting somewhere in the distance, and I held her while she shook, for exactly as long as she needed to shake. And then her breathing steadied and her hands tightened in my jacket, and she lifted her head.
He pulled me into him, and I let him. I let him, and I held on, and the sirens got closer, and eventually he was going to have to step back and deal with whatever was happening in my shop, and I was going to have to make a statement to someone, and the entire machinery of law enforcement was going to grind through what had just happened. But for those minutes, 2, 3, I didn't count. I let myself have this, the warmth of him, the solidity, the particular quality of being held by someone who holds you like they mean it, rather than like they're performing comfort. When I stepped back, I kept one hand in his jacket. I thought you were on your way to deal with the warrant news, I said. I was. His hands were still on my arms. And then I thought, she's going to be alone in the house for the shift change gap. And I turned around. I stared at him. You turned around. I turned around. I thought about the 2 hours, about the gap and the protection schedule, about the fact that he had known, because he'd been paying attention to the protection schedule, and he had turned around. He didn't call, didn't text to check. He just turned around. That's not just doing a job. That's something else, I thought. Seth, I said. Yeah. Why are you still here? He looked at me for a long moment. That deliberate stillness of his. The gathering of information before he decides anything. I think you know why, he said. Tell me anyway. The sirens were close. Any second, the driveway would be full of people and vehicles and questions. Any second, this small, still pocket of the afternoon would close. He looked at me with those steady brown eyes and he said, because I don't want to be anywhere you're not. And that's true whether or not there's a warrant and whether or not there's danger and whether or not he stopped, whether or not it's convenient. A state police cruiser turned into the driveway. I took a breath, stepped back, squared my shoulders. We're going to finish this conversation, I said. I know. Tonight, I said as I watched the cruiser come to a stop in front of us. Yes, he said. And he was already turning toward the cruiser, already moving toward the job that needed doing, and I stood in the driveway for one more second and let myself feel the full, terrifying weight of what I had just admitted to myself. I wasn't going back to Louisville.
The statements took until 8 o'clock. Marcus Combs went with the county sheriff with a list of charges that his attorney was going to have a very long night with. The protection detail was reinstated with corrected scheduling. My contact at state police was deeply apologetic about the gap, and I did not tell him that it had arguably turned out fine, because arguably turned out fine is not a metrics benchmark you want to normalize. I stayed through all of it because Abby had asked me to stay, and because there was nowhere I wanted to be except there. When the last cruiser left, the property went quiet the way it only does in rural Kentucky at night. Not silent, never fully silent, because there's the woods and the creek and the insects and the wind and the limestone hills. But quiet in a way that Louisville or any city never quite achieves. She'd been running on operational mode through all the statements, which I understood and respected, clear, precise, calm, all of her considerable intelligence directed at being useful to the process. I'd watched her from across the driveway and thought, there's a reason she survived this. Not luck. This. When it was done, she sat down on the porch steps and I sat beside her. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm beside mine. You said tonight, I said after a bit. I did. I'm holding you to that. She turned her head and looked at me. The porch light was doing the same things it had done that first night we'd sat out here, and she had a bruise coming up along her temple where the scrape was, and she was still the most compelling thing I'd looked at in a very long time. I'm not going back to Louisville, she said. Okay? The shop is viable. I've been through the books enough to know that with the debt cleared and some restructuring, it can work. This house is mine. The park is on the other side of my fence. She was watching me. I know you're the head ranger here. I know you have a job, and I know that job requires you to be... Here, I said, a beat. Here, she said. Abby. I turned toward her and I put it down. The careful management of it, the weighing, the waiting for a cleaner moment than this one right here in an evening that had been terrifying and exhausting and had also just permanently rearranged something in my chest. I turned the truck around today. I'm going to keep turning the truck around. That's not a temporary thing. She was looking at me the way she looked at problems she'd made up her mind about. You're still past due for a haircut, she said. I know. I'm just noting that. Noted? She smiled. Finally, fully. The one she couldn't plan. The one that surprised her. And then she leaned in, and I met her halfway, and she kissed me on the porch steps of her father's house with the October night around us and the cave country at her back. And it was nothing like careful, and nothing like convenient, and exactly like everything I'd been not saying for 2 months.
The kiss was slow and careful the way the first one always is when there's been a very long run-up to it, when you have had time to imagine it enough that the reality either disappoints or doesn't. This didn't disappoint. He kissed me like he had exactly as much time as he wanted, which, given the evening we'd had, was a particular kind of audacity that I found I was wholly in favor of. One hand came up to my jaw, tilted my head, and the other was still on the porch step between us, and the whole thing was unhurried in a way that made something behind my sternum ache. When we broke apart, his forehead came down to rest against mine. Come inside, I said. You know what you're asking. You know what it means. That's the point. He pulled back and looked at me in the porch light. Looking, The way he looked at things he wanted to understand fully before he decided. "You're sure?" Not a question exactly, more like giving me space to take it back if I wanted to. "Seth." I put my hand on his chest, felt his heart under my palm. "I've been sure for a while. I just had a lot of other things to deal with." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and then he stood, and he took my hand, and we went inside. The house was quiet and warm, and it felt different than it had, like it had been waiting to become something other than a grief exercise, and this was the moment. He turned the kitchen light off, and we stood in the dark for a moment, and then he pulled me to him by the waist, unhurried, and kissed me again, deeper this time. No audience, no emergency, nothing but the two of us in the dark kitchen and his hands at my waist and the scratch of his jaw against my face and the way his breath changed when I pressed closer. "Upstairs," I said against his mouth. We went upstairs. My room was dark. The window was cracked and the night came in. Cool limestone air and the sound of the woods. And Seth pulled the window closed without being asked because the night was getting cold and that attention to the small thing, the practical care of it, was somehow the thing that made everything real. I reached for the bedside lamp and he said, "Leave it off." And the dark was fine. Better than fine. We'd navigated worse than dark together. He was slow about it. I hadn't expected slow. I'd expected that the urgency of the evening would carry through. But he was slow and deliberate the way he was slow and deliberate about everything that mattered, and he found the hem of my shirt with careful hands and he paused there until I nodded, and then it was just skin and the cool air and the warmth of him. And I stopped being able to think about anything except the specific present moment. I pulled his shirt off and ran my hands over his back and shoulders. Broad, solid, the muscle of someone who actually works outdoors. And he shuddered slightly, which was its own gift. The knowledge that he was not immune to this, that beneath the careful management of everything was someone who wanted this the way I did, precisely and specifically. "Abby," he said, very quietly, like my name was itself something speakable. "Yeah," I said, "I don't have words for the rest of it that won't make it smaller than it was. I'll say this, it was the kind of thing where, afterward you understand that everything before it was just waiting, and you hadn't quite known you were waiting. I'll say that he was attentive in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuinely caring whether what was happening was good for both of us. I'll say that the night was long and unhurried and the woods kept their particular quiet outside the window, and when we finally lay still, I was tucked into the curve of his arm with his hand resting at the top of my head in the simplest possible shelter. "Hi," he said eventually. "Hi. You okay?" he asked as he trailed kisses down my neck. "Very much so." I turned my face into his shoulder. "You?" "Yeah." The word came out low and warm, the particular warmth of someone who means it all the way down. "Yeah, very much so." Outside, the wind moved through the tree line. My tree line. My woods. My house. Mine.
I lay awake for a while after she fell asleep. I did this deliberately. Not because I wasn't tired, I was deeply tired, but because I wanted to be awake for this specific arrangement of the world. Her shoulder against my ribs, the weight of her breathing, the dark of the room, and the sound of the woods at night. This is the thing, then. This is what it turns out was happening. I'd moved a lot in my career, 11 parks in 20 years. I told myself it was because the job required it, and that was true, and also it was easier to keep moving than to stay somewhere long enough to accumulate the kind of anchors that would make moving painful. Brownsville, Kentucky. 40 acres and a cave system, and a woman who navigated by dead reckoning and kept her father's coffee mug even though it made her hands shake to hold it. I thought about the ridge patrol I'd been on when I first saw her. Standing in the driveway looking at the tree line, that conversation she was having with the trees. She'd been saying, "I'm back. I'm staying." I understood that now. I pulled her a little closer in her sleep, and she made a small sound and didn't wake. Outside, a barred owl called, the one I'd been hearing in the eastern sector for the last month. The same voice every time, and I thought, yeah, I think I might be staying too.
The trial process was long and boring, and occasionally traumatic in the specific way that legal proceedings are when they involve the death of your father. Danny and Marcus Combs both pled eventually, a decision driven partly by the weight of evidence and partly, I was told, by certain information that other members of their organization had provided in exchange for consideration. It took 18 months. During those 18 months, I fixed the shop. I am not a mechanic. I mean, technically, I can take apart an engine, I can do the work. But I had a master's in marketing, and I knew how to run a business. And what Lockhart Auto had been missing, before everything went wrong, was any kind of coherent business strategy. So I hired 2 mechanics. I built a website that didn't look like it was made in 2003. I established service contracts with the 3-county fleet operations. I ran a campaign in the local paper that was extremely corny and extremely effective, and that my father would have been embarrassed by and also secretly delighted about. The shop started making money again in the 4th month. Real money. Sustainable money. Daddy, look, I'm putting it back together. That's what we do. Seth was there for all of it. He didn't live at my house. He had an apartment in town, which he actually started using after the immediate crisis resolved. But he was there most evenings and Sunday mornings, and whenever there was something that needed 2 people to lift. He was there for the day the settlement on the estate finally cleared, and I sat at the kitchen table and cried for an hour because it meant everything was legally, finally mine. He made tea, and he didn't say anything useful about it, and he stayed. He also kept walking on the street side of the sidewalk and opening doors and putting his jacket around my shoulders on cold nights before I knew I was cold. I kept not saying anything about it. It seemed like the kind of thing you don't put language to, because language would make it self-conscious, and I preferred it the way it was. Just part of how he moved through the world. One evening in spring, the trials were nearly over. The shop was turning a real profit. The tree line was going green. He came over for dinner, and he was quiet in a different way. Not thinking quiet. Something to say quiet. My superintendent asked about my contract renewal, he said. I set down my fork. Okay. She mentioned there's a regional coordinator position coming open. Based in Nashville. More money. Different scope. He was watching me. She's encouraging me to consider it. The thing that happened in my chest was specific and not subtle. What do you think? I asked. I think I want to stay here. No hesitation. I'm asking what you think. I looked at him across my father's kitchen table. 52,000 acres outside my back door. 400 miles of underground passages and however many more that no one had mapped yet. A shop full of the smell of motor oil and the sound of engines. A house where the 3rd stair still creaked and the blue walls were still the blue walls. And everything that had been terrible had somehow managed to make room for this. I think, I said, that the superintendent should find a different candidate for Nashville. His face did the thing it did when something landed right. That quiet shift, the warmth behind the steady. Yeah? Seth? I reached across the table and put my hand on his. You know every trail in that park now? You can navigate the underground from memory. You know which ridge the owl lives on, and you know what the water level means after rain, and you know... I stopped. You belong here, and I really want you to stay. He turned his hand under mine and held it. Okay, he said, just that. Okay. A pause. I'm going to move into the house. I blinked. That's a significant conclusion to jump to. It is, and I'm not sleeping in the guest room anymore. I'm just making it official. The corner of his mouth twitched up. Unless you object. I do not object, I thought. I have not had a single objection to anything about this man since approximately 3 days after he showed up at my door with his notebook and his reasonable questions. With those dark brown eyes, handsome smile, and his hair just long enough it was starting to curl at the back of his neck that was begging me to run my fingers through it. One condition, I said with a grin. Name it. You get a haircut. I reached up and ran my fingers through the hair at the back of his neck. He looked at me for a moment. Then he laughed. Fully, the whole thing, not the quiet version. And it was exactly as good as I'd thought it would be. Deal, he said as he pulled me into his arms. And this is where our story ends for today. If you enjoyed tagging along for this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this story is worth sharing, and it lets me know to create more content like this. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next chapter, subscribe and ring that bell. I've got more stories lined up that you definitely won't want to miss. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.